Hi, everyone, and welcome to the pilot episode of the Institute for the Study of Free Enterprises mini-series on the economics of the coronavirus pandemic. Today, I just want to keep it big picture and answer the question, why should we not count on the free market alone to solve a pandemic? In other words, why is there a role for government? What should that role look like? And how can the government work synergistically with private business to get us to the best possible outcome? So the answer in a word is externalities. So what is an externality? It's defined as a spillover cost or benefit to a third party who has no control over how that cost or benefit was created. In other words, a consumer and producer decide on a particular transaction, but that affects others as well who are not involved in that decision. An externality is an example, maybe the most prominent example of something we economists call market failure. A situation where we can't just assume that sort of the hands-off approach is automatically best. And so the issue here is that the consumers and producers are only going to respond to their personal costs and benefits, but those personal costs and benefits are not the same as the social costs and benefits. So you end up with this wedge between the, quote, free market outcome and the socially desirable outcome, which opens the door, at least in theory, for some sort of well-targeted government intervention to potentially make things better. So how do externalities apply in the case of a pandemic? And this is the issue of there being enormous positive externalities from preventive measures. So in other words, if I wash my hands, stay home, stay away from big crowds, well, that's obviously affecting my own disease risk, but it's also affecting the disease risk of a whole bunch of people, many of whom I never would have even met before. And that's what we refer to as exponential growth. So the estimates so far suggest that each infected person with the coronavirus, on average, spreads that infection to 2 to 3 others. So let's take the number 2. Let's take the low end. So exponential growth just means that you start with one person. Well, that one person spreads it to 2 others. And then those 2 people each spread it to 2 others. So you end up with 4 new people. And then those 4 each spread it to 2 more. So you end up with 8 new ones. And then on and on and on until before too long, you're over 1,000 and counting. And so that's really, you can think of that as externalities on steroids, right? Where it's not just do my actions affect another person or a few other people, but potentially thousands. And so the first thing we sort of tried here is the strong suggestions and really toothless guidance. So as an example, the Centers for Disease Control came out on March 15th with these pretty strong guidelines, among them that you should not get together for at least the next 2 weeks in groups of more than 10 people for any reason. And so that's not a law. It's not something really enforceable. It's just a strong suggestion, exhortation. So what does that get us in the case of externalities? It gets us scenes like spring break just a few days later. Hopefully none of you were in that picture, but if you were, economists wouldn't necessarily blame you. We would say that you are just a rational economic agent responding to your own personal costs and benefits. And if you are a young adult, your mortality risk of catching a pandemic in a situation like this is, or of dying from that pandemic is really pretty minimal. What that really tells us is that you don't address externalities just through information, right? The problem isn't that people don't know that they should be washing their hands or that they should be staying out of large groups to minimize their odds of getting the disease. The problem is the incentives. You've got to have some sort of intervention that actually alters the incentives that individuals have to do prevention or to go out in large crowds. And So how do you do that exactly? So the classic economic remedy for externalities, or sort of the textbook treatment, is taxes and subsidies. Okay, so if smoking cigarettes has a negative externality through secondhand smoke, you tax cigarettes and try to tweak the incentives so that you get closer to the socially optimal level. Well, it's hard to see how you could really do that in a situation like the pandemic. You can't really subsidize staying home necessarily. You can't really monitor that. So all you're really left with is various levels of just shutting things down. Of, in the more extreme end, these stay-at-home orders, down to kind of a softer end of closing down, say, the schools and moving that online, closing down universities, why we're doing our institute programming this way now and not in person. So there are all these different levers related to shutting down different aspects of the economy. And really, if you kind of follow the economic logic, you end up inevitably with the only possible real solution to this externality issue in a pandemic is switching on some of these shutdowns. But that, of course, leads to the bigger question of just, well, so it's easy to say that in general, harder to say, well, how much of a shutdown and how long should those last for, right? And so this is really kind of the million-dollar question then. And there is really no particular reason then to think that, with all the uncertainty, even among expert opinions, that the government is going to nail that exactly right. So you end up with a situation where could, quote, government failure potentially make things even worse in terms of overshooting or undershooting. And you always kind of worry about that in general with government's attempts to step in and deal with market failures. That's not just a blank check to do whatever random kind of intervention you dream up, that the intervention has to be specific and targeted at that market failure. And we use the term kind of the minimally invasive economic intervention to accomplish that. So kind of easier said than easy to say the government should have a role, harder to say exactly what that role should be, but it probably has to involve some level of a shutdown rather than just throwing out information and hoping that people follow it. So that's a little bit depressing. So what do I see kind of to try to end on a more positive note? What do I kind of see as the end game of the coronavirus pandemic? And I think the way I would look at it is that the government's job with these shutdown levers is really to just buy us time for innovators, largely in the private sector, to kind of do their thing. So it's really the government with a role to buy us time so that the usual forces of free markets can sort of, for lack of a better word, come to the rescue. So by buying us time through these kind of slowdown, shutdown measures, innovators are going to be able to come up with treatments. You're already seeing a lot of progress made on that front, potentially, with this chloroquine and Z-Pak combo and others. To come up with ways to deploy large-scale testing to really track and better target where the isolation efforts need to be focused. Antibody testing to get a better sense of disease prevalence, to really know, well, hey, how big is this risk exactly? And then ultimately, although this would be longer term, to come up with a vaccine. And the neat thing when you look at this idea of governments buying time so that the private sector kind of operators can do their thing, is you really see this broader theme that private businesses with their profit motives still can align with these broader social goals, right? That you're developing treatments and new tests and vaccines. There's a profit motive underlying that, but that is ultimately what's necessary to get us to a real solution here. Now, but for the externality reason, of course, just sitting back and letting them do their thing isn't enough. So again, the role of the government, in addition to kind of buying us time, is also then to do whatever it can to expedite the process of coming up with these treatments, tests, etc. And so that's really how I see this sort of playing out, and hopefully sooner rather than later. So thanks for watching, and we hope that you join us again next time.